The Museum of Political Corruption is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution committed to educating the public and encouraging solutions that promote ethics reform and good governance. Since its founding in 2015, the museum has offered innovative and engaging programming, from pop-up exhibits and roundtable discussions to a cutting-edge film series and a historical walking tour of downtown Albany. The museum has promoted civics in the classroom, worked with international delegations, and curates a collection of quotes on ethical leadership from today's most esteemed public figures. In December 2021, the museum opened its doors to a virtual museum, offering visitors an engaging and interactive experience. Our museum's work can only be sustained with your help. Your ideas, your visions for a more ethical future, and your financial support are greatly appreciated.
Thank you for doing this. And we congratulate you on being one of our very first groups of honorees in what we call the Hall of Honor, which is right next to the Hall of Shame. The goal of the Museum of Political Corruption is to make corruption history, to try to end it through a combination of education, humor. We're going to offer you some kickbacks when we're done with this talk. To say thank you for doing this. And so you are one of our honorees. John, what I'd like to ask you, if you could just tell us just in a general way to get started, from where you sit, from your experience, having been at the center of the Watergate scandal, as we were talking about a little bit before starting this interview, one of the most important political confrontations of the second half of the 20th century. How do we make corruption history?
We make corruption history by putting the truth out as to what did happen and what didn't happen and keeping that story honest. There are a lot of revisionists who come along. There are a lot of deniers who appear at the outset. I've always been convinced that, you know, 90% of Watergate, as we know the scandal, from the break-in to the resignation, was pure bungling on the part of the Watergate burglars. I have never seen evidence they were sent by the Nixon White House. Did the Nixon White House know there were people who thought like that? You bet. In fact, had they have not been arrested at the Watergate complex, they were on the way to McGovern's headquarters on Capitol Hill, where they might have been arrested, and that would have given another name to the because they were going there because Nixon wanted to remove the plant, and he wasn't talking about flowers, the Muskie headquarters to the McGovern headquarters. Muskie being the leading initial candidate,
Right.
McGovern emerging as the stronger candidate and the more likely nominee, and in fact, the nominee of the Democratic Party. So when they get arrested at the Watergate, they're really just stopping by to fix an earlier bungled job where they had not been able to get into Larry O'Brien's office, didn't even know where he was located at the Democratic National Committee. And they had gone back to try to find his telephone and bug it and take pictures of any documents they thought might have numbers and somehow be incriminating. There is not a lot of mystery, notwithstanding some revisionist efforts and conspiracy buffs around what they were doing. It was just a bungled job.
When you look at the anatomy of corruption from just with that starting point, so if Nixon and his circle had just told the truth from day one and said this was a bungled operation by a group on my campaign staff, he could have avoided this whole problem.
Couldn't do it. Here was the problem, and I quickly discovered in hours of them being arrested at the Watergate. Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, who were the organizers, masterminds, and part of the burglary team at the Watergate, had worked at the Nixon White House. What had they done at the Nixon White House? They'd earlier done a break-in at the Nixon White House and into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office when Daniel Ellsberg leaked the so-called Pentagon Papers. This is what caused the White House to be interested in what was going on at the re-election committee, where they were unaware of the fact they were going to mount this effort to go in the Watergate. Nixon, I think, was telling the truth when he said, I would have never sent anybody into the Watergate because I knew that there was nothing at the national headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. That doesn't mean that they weren't on a mission that came directly out of the Oval Office. Not that Nixon had given it. He had just said, he told Bob Haldeman to change your intelligence gathering from Muskie, who was the leading candidate against him initially, to McGovern. And Liddy had interpreted that when he said to take their plant and move it from Muskie to McGovern, the plant being a chauffeur they had in the Muskie operation. Liddy, who had pushed everything to the outer edge, would have taken that as a signal, I'm going to go burglarize and bug the McGovern headquarters, which they tried to do. They didn't do it successfully, so they were going back the night they were arrested in the Watergate to go to McGovern's headquarters. So if you told the truth about who these guys were, you were in trouble because, as it happened, the president hadn't even known of this break-in into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. He set up the operation, the so-called plumbers, to track down leaks in the White House, but he hadn't given this order. In fact, he doesn't even learn about it until months and months and months after the break-in at the Watergate. He learns from me when he finally starts talking to me about the cover-up. He learns, here's the problem. These guys were working for the White House and broke in Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. The whole kit and caboodle of them. The men who were actually arrested, the Cuban Americans, as well as Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, who had sort of masterminded the operation at the bungled operation at the Democratic National Committee. So it linked right back to the White House. There was a solution, though. There was,
what was the solution? If Nixon at that moment had wanted to do the right thing, was there a right thing to do?
When I came in and told Nixon there was a cancer on his presidency on March 20th, 21st of 1973, he could have saved himself. I tried to lay that out in a way where I escalated the information I was giving him, hoping at some point his fist would come down on the table, because I had told him on the 17th of March about the Ellsberg break-in, and now he's learning the details about a cover-up that's going to consume him. And what's he say? He surprises me when I tell him that Howard Hunt's asking for $120,000 of what I now know is hush money. And he says, well, don't you think we better pay that? And I also raised the fact, these guys are going to be asking for money indefinitely. And who knows how much they'll ask for? And he asked me, well, how much could it cost? And I pull out of thin air a figure that I thought would offend him. I said, this could cost $1 million. Well, to my surprise, he responds, that's no problem, John. I know where we get $1 million. When I left the office, I know today he went to see Rose Woods, his secretary, who's right off the Oval Office, and asked Rose, how much do we have in our slush fund? He had all the wrong reactions. He wasn't exactly the person I thought he was. I really thought he would react highly negatively to that information, that he wasn't fully informed, for he wasn't fully informed. But as he gets the information, he does all the wrong things with it.
So, John, being in that situation, if you were to advise someone today, having lived through being a whistleblower, having been through that situation, knowing that you might need to tell the truth about your boss, which could put you in extreme jeopardy. As I said, at that time, you had no idea how this would play out. He was the president, you were the lawyer. He was a much more powerful person. What would you tell someone who's thinking about being a whistleblower, but is trying to find the North Star, the courage, the wherewithal to go down that road and talk truth to power?
Ken, I was very young at that time. I confronted Nixon with all this, and I have 35 conversations in the totality of my relationship, 37. 35 of them are recorded. I know exactly what we talked about and when we talked about it. A couple of the conversations disappeared. I understand why. They were again, he made himself look really bad in responding to my efforts to get this thing behind us. What would I tell others? The truth is always, if I'd have been 45 or 55, a seasoned lawyer, I would have gone in there and pushed him and said, Mr. President, if you want to go to jail as president, you'll continue down the road of conduct you're undertaking. And I would have laid it out in much, much grimmer terms. I would have pushed him around a little bit. Today I would have no trouble doing that. Right. So, it's, where are you in the pecking order isn't as important as where information that's damaging to the presidency, to the country, and making that case, particularly when they're engaging in criminal conduct. You can draw a line and say, and I virtually did after that. When I realized I had not convinced him to do anything, that's when I break rank. And that's when I start looking for a lawyer. That's when I start doing a lot of things, because I realize this is going downhill, but I know one thing that'll end it. It's the truth. And so I knew that was a ripcord, because I wasn't going to live my life in the shadow of a cover-up, because you just can't live that way.
So when you testified for those, I don't remember how many days, it was several days before the Irvin Watergate committee, in front of the country, national coverage, gavel to gavel, day after day. What was that like? Was that a freeing experience because you finally got to speak your piece? Or was
I made it before I went to the Senate, and before I went public. I tried quietly to do this before the grand jury. It was really I had one foot in the White House and one foot out. And I knew by going to the grand jury, it would all be secret. Grand juries are not open affairs. Right. I knew by going to the Senate, it would become the end of the presidency. So I try to see how my colleagues respond and whether they're going to do the right thing or the wrong thing. And when I realized they're going to make me the scapegoat,
Mhm.
I send them the first public statement I ever made about Watergate was
Mhm.
having my secretary call the Washington Post, the New York Times, the AP,
Mhm.
UPI, and tell my colleagues I'm not going to be a scapegoat. They
Mhm.
weren't communicating with me anymore. So I very publicly sent them a message. So by the time I get to the Senate,
Uh-huh.
I'm really at war with everybody in the White House. Uh,
Mhm.
he finally he finally lets everybody go that's involved on
Mhm.
April 30th, and I will testify. I was going to testify in May initially,
Mhm.
but they get the Senate Watergate Committee to delay me a
Right.
week when Brezhnev came to the United States. They didn't think it would have been a little unseemly with
Mhm.
me up there and Brezhnev here. But when I went up, I'm in a very familiar atmosphere. I'm a former committee counsel in the House
Mhm.
Judiciary Committee.
Right.
I know a number of the members of the Senate committee.
Mhm.
Uh, it's just a very comfortable forum. It's much easier to testify on Capitol Hill than the 2 weeks I spent testifying in the courtroom in the ultimate trial of Nixon's chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, his former
Mhm.
attorney general, John
Right.
Mitchell, my former predecessor, John Ehrlichman. Trial testimony is just tighter, more difficult, what have
Mhm.
you. Hearsay rules apply and what have you.
Mhm.
I did make a mistake. I hand wrote a 60,000 word statement, which
Mhm.
I just planned to submit and summarize. I had no idea I would have to read the statement, which was typed into some 200 pages of when
Really?
the draft was finished. And
That took about a full day or two to read. I remember that when from that era.
it would take 8 hours to read the statement.
Mhm.
And that was, as I say, had I known I was going to read it, it would not have been. It would not have been 60,000 words. I still have it in my archives,
Uh-huh.
uh, the statement, and I kept the statement because I prepared it so quickly. I was convinced somebody would say, "Oh, who prepared that for you, Dean?" And
Mhm.
you're just reading somebody else's material.
Mhm.
And in fact, I had uh, written it just rather swiftly,
Mhm.
and my wife had typed part of it, and my lawyer's secretaries typed other parts, and it went through three different drafts.
Mhm.
The reading draft of this testimony is in the Smithsonian.
Uh-huh.
The original draft I have in my archive, as I said. But I realized that we were reaching an interesting and broad audience when I was told at first they had a pool camera that covered the hearings. They were initially they had all the networks were covering the first few witnesses, but it got boring very quickly
Mhm.
because of the confrontation that the White House was putting up about my testimony, with the
Mhm.
Brezhnev delay just heightening
Right. The
the
suspense.
tension, and I'm making it very clear that I'm going to blow the whistle,
Mhm.
and everybody better hang on. Um, it resulted in all the networks carrying the pool camera, so it's on all the networks in PBS. And I years later, read that we reached 85 million households, and who knows how many people within a household. So I've never seen any uh, as to the number of people, but I certainly know it's the way you blow a low profile. Is
Certainly. Did you have a sense of how much your life had changed by the day after or the week after?
I By the time I testified, I'm in the witness protection program of the U.S. Marshals because of threats that had come to the committee.
Oh, I see.
Chairman Irvin was very concerned. He talked to the
Mhm.
Capitol Police. They said, "Listen, we this is way beyond our level
Mhm.
of police protection." And but so they Sam Dash, the chief counsel, and Chairman
Mhm.
Irvin of the committee asked Archibald Cox, who's actually trying to block my testimony. He has just been appointed, and he doesn't want me up there as a witness.
Oh, he
Uh,
wants you in the grand jury room or in the the criminal trials.
He wants me in a grand jury room, and he's also aware of a Supreme Court ruling called Castigar,
Mhm,
where if a witness is publicly has to testify, as it would later evolve, the government has to make a choice. They have to
mhm,
either take your witness in one form or another. They can't use the influence that one bit of testimony will have on a trial.
mhm,
So that, in essence, while I had immunity from all my testimony, so I couldn't be prosecuted for anything I had to say unless I committed perjury.
mhm,
Uh, I I was also in a position where I could protect myself for my mistakes, which
mhm.
I had come to realize by that point, and was very open and did not try to sugarcoat them when I went before the Senate.
You had mentioned at the very beginning that you were concerned about revisionism and denials. That when scandals like this come up, people try to change the history and pretend they didn't happen. So with Watergate, um, are there particular myths or falsehoods about Watergate that
There, there have been a number of myths and efforts to create conspiracy theories around Watergate
Mhm,
that make me a central character. And actually, they want to make my wife a central character. And at one point, there was a book published that I decided this has gone too far. This is just straight out defamation. So I brought a lawsuit, and for a public figure, I knew it was
mhm,
a rough road to hoe. But I had two goals in the lawsuit. One is, of course, was to prove it was bogus, even if I just based on discovery. And secondly, was to open up files since I had a subpoena that probably wouldn't be opened in my lifetime. Uh, Both of which I accomplished. The lawsuit went on for 10 years. It was settled. I didn't want to own St. Martin's Press or have a
mhm.
hook on Gordon Liddy's life and the other players involved. So I reached a settlement that I cannot disclose. My wife, as I say, after 9 years of litigation,
Uh-huh.
and we are only allowed to say we were satisfied with the settlement,
Okay.
which we were.
Speaking of Gordon Liddy, did you happen to watch the recent streaming drama about Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt with Woody Harrelson? And what did you think?
I have watched some of the revised or some of the streaming versions that are now out of Watergate, and they have nothing to do with reality. And California law is such that
Mhm,
they can just write out defame me. They can make me responsible for the Watergate break-in, as they largely do. I know from the script of one of them. But I've given up. You know, it's just they have no respect for history. They want to tell their story in the
mhm.
most dramatic way. So my character becomes whatever the screenwriter wants to do, and there's just virtually nothing I can do about it. So
Yeah.
I've given up trying. I motion picture industry is much more sensitive than the television streaming industry. I say that because there was a movie called Felt, and there were 19. Someone sent me this. I live in a small town, and this industry um, is actually a small business, notwithstanding the numbers that are involved. So I know a lot of people in the movie business, and they will, when there's something that's Watergate related or related to me, they'll send it to me. And I did get an advance copy of the Felt movie, which was a feature
Mhm,
that was being done after he had surfaced as Bob Woodward's Source Deep Throat. Uh, I read the script. There were 19 scenes, just flat out defamation about my role in Brigade and my relationship with Phelps. And so I wrote up a memo. I happened to know the producers and didn't hear from them. And I actually knew who the director was.
uh-huh.
Um, to make a long story short, he wouldn't talk to me. He knew he was doing screwy stuff,
Right.
and so what I did is I learned that the small claims courts in California have jurisdiction over defamation.
Mhm.
So I filed a lawsuit against him. And after the sheriff knocked on his door with a subpoena and serving him with a complaint, I was able to get him on the phone.
Uh-huh.
To make a long story short, we got those 19 scenes removed. So,
Excellent.
sometimes, and the movie is it was a commercial disaster. Is he and he knows that the best part of the story was my story. He took it out. So anyway, uh,
Okay.
sometimes
But,
I am able to affect Hollywood's version of history. Other
mhm,
times I'm not. And this is somewhat ironic since I did my senior thesis in as an undergraduate on verisimilitude in the political novel.
uh-huh.
I did Alan Drury's Advice and Consent
A
book, which
wonderful book. Yeah.
it's a great story, and Drury was steeped in Senate procedure, so it's
Mhm.
very
Yeah.
uh,
Well, he was a reporter, I think, for the Washington Post before he wrote that book. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
One more direct Watergate question. So, in the years after President Nixon resigned, did you ever have occasion to personally bump into either Nixon or Haldeman or Ehrlichman or Colson and talk to them? And how did any of them, as far as you know, ever actually feel bad about what they did?
While I was never imprisoned for Watergate,
Right.
I Sirica smacked me with a 1 to 4 year
Mhm.
sentence, which lasted 127 days in
Mhm.
confinement. But I'm in the witness protection program,
Right.
so they take me to a facility that the marshals ran outside
Mhm.
Washington D.C. in Baltimore called Camp Hollibird. Uh,
Mhm.
Hollibird. And Colson was brought there also when he was going to testify. So Colson immediately decides he wants to convert me to become a born again Christian. And you know, his argument was, John, you could fill stadiums with your name
Mhm.
uh, as a born again Christian. And he said, this could be you really could have a whole new career. I
Mhm.
said, Chuck, it's not my thing. Meanwhile, we did have conversations, and he did admit
Mhm.
that he had done wrong and stupid things. Uh,
Mhm.
the problem was Chuck went from somebody who had strong beliefs first in his father, then the Marine Corps, then Richard Nixon, and then
Mhm.
Jesus, were the order of his submission to higher authority.
Mhm.
He's a classic authoritarian personality,
Mhm.
which I have studied at some length. That's on my mind because I'm writing another book about it right as we
Right.
talk. But anyway, yes, I did talk to Chuck, and at some length, and he actually came to my home here in
Mhm.
California. We socialized and remained friendly and what have you. I ran into Haldeman at a high-rise building where he was working for a guy by the name of Murdoch as a sort of an aide, and then later running one of some of Murdoch's empire. Uh,
This is the Rupert Murdoch publisher.
no,
No.
not Rupert Murdoch. He's a real estate developer, very successful California real estate developer and
Mhm.
entrepreneur. And he, in essence, sort of had the chief of staff role,
Mhm.
and then moved on to run some of Murdoch's. I think he had some franchise that he gave Haldeman a good deal on, and he ran those. And later would, of course, dig out his papers that he had buried in the Nixon library and do a diary that's a pretty, had that diary existed during Watergate, would have solved an awful lot of problems. But
Mhm.
it was a diary based on his notes from the day, and he was a copious note taker.
Mhm.
So it's a good record, the Haldeman diary. It's just straight down the middle. He just plays it exactly the way things happened, not as he would later have such a tragically failed memory for a
Yeah.
level intelligence,
Yeah.
which is suspect to say the least. So
Yeah.
yes, I ran into Haldeman. He said, "Let's have lunch." I said, "I agree." We
Mhm.
talked at the elevator for a short while, and I remember him saying, my staff did pretty well as opposed to Ehrlichman's. We didn't get in nearly as much trouble. I said, "That's right, we did. We didn't." I said, he gave me his card, and I said, "I'll give you a call, and we'll set up a lunch."
Mhm.
Next thing I heard was from one of his aides that he had stomach cancer, and
Oh,
because of his Christian Science religion, he was going to refuse any medical treatment. So it was terminal. I mean, it was treatable, but he
mhm.
wasn't going to have it treated. I understand from Christian Scientists that he is a big deal for having not taken medical treatment. Ehrlichman, for example, was a Christian Scientist also, and he
Mhm.
did take medical treatment, although it didn't work for him. Um, and they both died pretty young.
Yeah.
Uh, but as I say, I never did have a reunion with Haldeman. I
Mhm.
did meet with Ehrlichman during my lawsuit,
Mhm.
bogus account of Watergate. Ehrlichman had supplied all of the nasty thoughts he could accumulate and bought totally into the conspiracy theory and said, "Oh yes, it must have all have been John Dean because I didn't know any of this, and I knew he had an attractive wife, but
Right.
I didn't know that she was tied into all this and all that sort of business." So I deposed Ehrlichman during the lawsuit, and
Really?
he
You
just
you you as a lawyer, you deposed him.
as well. I had my lawyer do it. I was not my own lawyer. I didn't
Uh-huh.
make that foolish mistake. I hired a really good boutique law firm
Mhm.
uh, that it was my at one point we had 17 lawyers on the other side,
Wow.
and I think I have drafted every motion under the rules of civil
Mhm.
procedure that can come up in a lawsuit.
Mhm.
uh, I did the first draft and then let the lawyers uh, do the final draft, and it's a good shop, so they would polish my stuff. And
Mhm.
anyway, I lightened the load that way for them,
Mhm.
and they were willing to take it on a contingency basis. I just had to pay the out of pocket, which were hefty six figures.
Yeah.
But I was in a position where I could do it, and the suit law went on for almost 10 years. So
Mhm.
anyway, when I
Okay.
when I deposed Ehrlichman, he
Mhm.
stared daggers. He was really bitter.
Mhm.
He didn't want to be deposed, and he kept telling uh, uh, lots of asides. He also didn't want to commit perjury,
Right.
so he didn't do the defendants any favors in the deposition. He didn't want to do me any favors, but he
Uh-huh.
also knew that there was a pretty good record, and he knew that I wouldn't hesitate to go after him further if
Right.
he did perjure himself. So
Uh,
anyway, I remember one scene in the elevator after the deposition, it was a lunch break, and we were going down. I was with my lawyer, who's relatively young, younger than me at the time, and he said to me, he, uh, he said, your lawyer, John, reminds me of Richard Benveniste, who I never did like. Comments like that. And I said, "Well, but John, I guess I'm not going to get a Christmas card from you this year." He said, "You mean I've been sending you Christmas cards?" I said, "I'm being totally facetious." Anyway, it was a very uncomfortable ride in the elevator for him. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
there you go.
Just sticking it to him. Uh,
Uh,
so
let,
our,
let, let me
our,
let,
rela- our relationship had changed dramatically as a result of Watergate.
let me move you on from this. In the years after Watergate, you've written a number of books on a number of subjects. Two kind of jumped off the page when I was thinking about this. Um, about 20 years after Watergate in 2004, I guess that's 30 years after, you wrote a book called Worse Than Watergate about the George W. Bush years. Then after that, more recently, you wrote a book called Authoritarian Nightmare about the Donald Trump years. Does it surprise you that in your lifetime that you would end up having to write two books about presidents who abused power on a level comparable to Richard Nixon, that problem in our country would recur? And what does that say about our country and our need for vigilance to protect against that?
I'm actually at this moment in the process of writing a book where I pull together some of my prior books, some of which you just mentioned. I did a book called Worse Than Watergate, and I actually jumped the gun on that title because Donald Trump and his presidency is truly worse than anything that during Watergate. Trump has changed the way we look at the presidency, and it's ongoing. We still have the threat. There is, as we talk, it's not inconceivable he could end up back in the White House.
Yes.
So it's not likely. It's not inconceivable, though. But anyway, yes, I have written, and the Worse Than Watergate about Bush and Cheney. What prompted me to use that title was the fact that their secrecy was much more extreme than Nixon's. They're pushing the outer limits of the presidency post 9/11 was much more extreme than Nixon. And the killer for me and the surprise for me was that they authorized torture. And the blatant war crimes. I don't think Richard Nixon in his darkest day would have authorized torture. He was a World War II veteran. He'd been in the South Pacific where torture was commonly employed, and he, I'm sure, had no tolerance for it. And I just think that it was sort of way beyond the level of activity that occurred during Watergate. So that's why that title got used. As I say, I wished I hadn't used it when Trump arrived, because we're a whole different ballgame now. The book I wrote, Authoritarian Nightmare, actually comes from a book and research I did as a result of the Nixon White House. When I watched my colleagues and the way they reacted to things and the things they did, it was so different than my mentality. I said, who are these people? What kind of personalities are they? And slowly over the years, I collected a lot of information that led me to study authoritarianism, which is broken down by social science into, authoritarian governments and how they operate, typically looking at foreign rulers who are nothing short of dictators, to the more common study that started post World War II in the United States, the authoritarian personality. And I found that my former colleagues and Richard Nixon were clearly authoritarians. They were authoritarian leader types and authoritarian follower types. And something social science calls double high, where they test high on everything. And yes, that became a book that described the Trump presidency, who is a poster boy for authoritarianism. And it's not, that story isn't over. And that's the book I'm working on.
I hope it's not set for publication Inauguration Day 2025.
Hopefully not. Hopefully it'll be out before the election.
Well, another thing that you've done that I wanted to ask if you could talk about a little bit is from your experience as being the White House Counsel, being the lawyer to the president, finding that your client had violated the law and trying to figure out what as a lawyer you're supposed to do. You've taught a number of CLE courses, continuing legal education courses for lawyers across the country. Could you talk about that a little bit? What you're trying to do?
When I went to the White House as White House Counsel, I was 31 years of age. I understood. I wasn't stupid at 31, but
Mhm,
I understood I wasn't really going to be the White House counsel, that
mhm,
John Ehrlichman, my predecessor, was giving up the title to, and Nixon and the staff had decided to induce me to come
mhm,
into the White House. They wanted me on the staff. Uh, and to do that, they had to give me that title.
mhm,
I wasn't going to go to work for John Ehrlichman. I had a great job as an associate deputy attorney general at the Department of Justice. I was at a young age, about number 13 in the
mhm.
pecking order at the Justice Department.
Right.
And as when I told my boss, the attorney general, where I was going and what I had been offered, he said, I can understand why you want to go over there with that title. But John Mitchell knew Richard Nixon very well, knew John Ehrlichman very well, and said, Ehrlichman will never give up the job. I said, I understand that.
Mhm.
Uh, but I went over and did all the grunt work of the counsel's office. I'm not called on, and I will have all my conversations fortunately recorded. Excuse me. I will fortunately have all my conversations with Richard Nixon recorded, so I know exactly. There were some 37 conversations. Two of them have disappeared.
Mhm.
One of them is a telephone conversation from Florida, where there was no recording equipment. But I have testified to them all, and I have the transcripts of them all.
Mhm.
Indeed, did a book called "The Nixon Defense"
Yes.
because he tried to set me up as a scapegoat
Mhm.
uh, by claiming he knew nothing of a cover up until I came in and
Mhm.
told him that there was a cancer on his presidency and he was going to sink. I When they stopped communicating with me, I responded in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the AP, that they had picked the wrong man for scapegoat,
Mhm.
and there was pretty much of a
Mhm.
pitched battle between yours truly and the Nixon White House.
Right.
We know how that ended. So
Mhm.
uh, the truth has its way of being much stronger than the lies. When I did a book that I would have never done had I known what I was getting into, called
Mhm.
The Nixon Defense, I
Mhm.
had to end up transcribing all of Nixon's Watergate conversations. Nobody
Mhm.
had even tracked them all down. There were about 1,000 conversations running
Right.
from less than a minute to one that
Mhm.
runs 8 hours. A tape of Nixon
Mhm.
listening to his conversation, most of his conversations with me,
Mhm.
and only interrupted by his press secretary, Ron Ziegler, from time to time. But anyway, in assembling this book, I was able to hear a lot of other conversations, and I realized there's a lot of lessons in these tapes for lawyers about what not to do and
Mhm.
mistakes you can make. So I called a friend who is an attorney in Cleveland,
Mhm.
Jim Obenall, and I said, let's build a CLE on Watergate. He had just come from a Kent State CLE, and he said, "Great idea." We spent 6 months putting together the first version of that, which has now evolved to many iterations, and it's been very, very, excuse me, it's been the CLE program has been very successful. We've done about 150, 60. We lost count long ago.
Mhm.
Maybe somewhere between 75 and 90,000 lawyers have attended.
Mhm.
So we've gotten the word out there, and we had a lot of fun with it.
Mhm.
Been to a lot of nice resorts to players treat themselves well
Right.
for different sessions. And the ABA was very much encouraging for me to do this. So
Mhm.
it's been a good drill. The problem is
Mhm.
the CLE and ethics that came post Watergate, which was, first of all, every law school that's accredited has to teach ethics. There's a national ethics examination. You have to take continuing legal education, CLE programs,
Right.
to keep your ethical edge and professionalism
Mhm.
at the highest level. The problem is the Trump presidency came along, and who's right at the center of it? Lawyers, again.
Yes.
Uh, and they seem to not be aware of, because different bar associations
Mhm.
enforce them, some don't.
Right.
Some don't even require really CLEs.
Yeah.
So the enforcement of the bar associations, there's
Mhm.
probably a study could be done to show those who are aggressive in enforcing their CLE and ethics requirements probably have more ethical lawyers than some who don't.
That's
And
right.
the Trump presidency has showed that the post-Watergate efforts of the bar are a failure.
Yes, I think we talked about this once, and ironically, the Washington D.C. bar, which I belong to, has no CLE requirement. And
The Washington D.C. bar has no CLE requirement. It
mm,
has no guts. You
mhm,
have to literally lay a criminal case that is completed in front of the bar, and they may take the
mhm,
guy's license away.
uh-huh. There you go. So I want to ask you about one other president. You've had to stand up and speak out against President Nixon, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, but you also wrote a book about Warren G. Harding, who has a reputation for being one of the more corrupt presidents in American history. And with him, you took a different point of view, a different stance. You tried to look at his record in a way other people hadn't, with his papers and with documentation, and you ended up defending him. Tell us about that.
Warren Harding, whose biography I wrote for uh, the editor of a series on, at that point, all 42 past presidents,
Mm,
Arthur Schlesinger Jr.
mm,
Uh, I called Arthur and I said, "What are you going to do with Warren Harding?" He said, "I have no idea." I said, "Listen, I lived in Warren Harding's town.
mm,
He was the editor, and actually, he was the publisher and creator of the Marion Star. The
mm,
editor later years was my next door neighbor. He
mm,
gave me my first books about Harding. He
mm,
knew the people who had been there when Harding was there.
mm,
He said, John, he said, I think Harding might be the most maligned president we have in history. I tend to, he was planting a seed that proved true when you look at the facts.
mm,
He Warren Harding was involved in zero scandals. When
mm,
he heard of a scandal, he damn near choked a guy at the
mm,
Veterans Administration that his wife had wanted to head the VA.
mm,
Harding has been so mischaracterized and misunderstood. He's actually one of the better presidents, and that's the facts bear that out. I remember I had a call from my successor at the White House, Len Garman,
mm,
who said he was in a taxi cab at the time, and he had just finished reading a review of my book by the Wall Street Journal, and
mm,
which said it's the best book on Harding that's been written. He said,
mm,
"I'm on my way to the bookstore, John, to get the book."
mm,
He said, "We need to understand this." Anyway, they do sell the book at the Harding home, and so
uh-huh,
it is out there. And there is no Harding library because, yes, the family totally mishandled the papers. What
mm.
they're hiding is he did have some affairs. The ladies liked him. Uh,
That part is true. Yeah.
and he had a an affair for 15 years with a neighbor's wife.
Mm,
The neighbor had to know. They didn't exactly hide it. They went to Europe all together, and his wife really was incapable. She was his business partner. She
mm,
wasn't his lover. The neighbor was the lover. And when that relationship broke up, the neighbor had tried to force Warren to block the United States from getting involved in World War One against Germany, and he broke the relationship off over that. He said, "You're wrong." He said, "I wouldn't begin to do that." Again, the high road,
mm,
always by this guy.
mm,
Uh, he he does have an affair with a young girl who literally seduced him by the name of Nan Britton. They would have a child. He didn't know about it until after it happened, uh, and he would have his sister take care of this child.
mm,
He never fessed up to this. And my book, where there's an extended footnote that we can test this now
mm,
with DNA, Indeed, one of the Harding family tracked down the apparent, in fact, actual grandson of Warren Harding, and DNA confirmed it, and that ended the speculation. So the book brought an end to that mystery. But anyway, yes, Harding is our most maligned president. Not Trump by any stretch of the imagination, not Nixon. All presidents complain about their press. Actually, Harding got pretty good press because he was one of them, and he's one of the ones who started bringing them into the Oval Office and having press conferences after Woodrow Wilson, who wouldn't talk to anybody in the press other than to give them, if they would take exactly what he wanted them to hear.
Okay. John, let me just ask one last thing. That was my last question. Is there anything else that you'd like to get off your chest while I got you here? You've been okay, John. You've been extremely generous with your time with us, and I really appreciate it. On behalf of the Museum of Political Corruption, we honor the fact that you're going to be part of our Hall of Honor, and you're a very fitting selection for that. I just want to say thank you for spending the time with us and giving us such a personal view of politics.
The truth has its way of being much stronger than the lies.